How do you express a love of your country? In 2024, this seems like quite a simple question. But in the 19th century, deciding whether you did approve of what your country was doing on the international stage could be even more fraught than it is today. Now imagine the challenges that women had in an age when they weren't allowed to vote and were discouraged from being too engaged in the business of politics. A few weeks ago, we opened the discussion on this by looking at how Britain defined itself and the dangers that women faced if they were too vocal in their patriotism. Now, it's time to finish the conversation. Tonight, Emma MacLeod makes a welcome return to the show as we discuss the letters of two women who offer very different perspectives on the way in which women navigated this problem. We talk about the unusual flavour of their blend of patriotism, the wider challenges facing women during this period, and the impact that patriotic women could have on society, while raising an important point on the richness of perspectives that can be garnered by looking at 50% of the population, which are often erroneously dismissed as having done, said, and written little of significance during the period. If you're skeptical about the importance and eye-opening benefits of studying women during the Napoleonic era, this is an episode you simply cannot miss. This is Forgotten Voices of the Home Front, Patriotic Women in Napoleonic Britain. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where, as you will have heard from the intro, we are back in the realm of patriotism, but not any patriotism. We are looking at the much ignored element of women expressing their patriotism in a myriad of different ways. This is, of course, episode 2. If you missed our first installment with our fantastic guest, please do go back in the back catalogue, where you will find the first installment. And it will be important for you to have had a listen to that before you tune into this one, because we talk about a number of very big themes and gradually move towards discussing female expressions of patriotism and how women had to navigate the men in order to be able to actually express themselves in the way that they wanted to when it came to patriotism. Joining us to discuss is Emma MacLeod, a senior lecturer in history at the University of Stirling. She is the author of A War of Ideas, British Attitudes to the Wars Against Revolutionary France, and British Vision of America, 1775 to 1820. She's also co-edited Political Trials in the Age of Revolutions and the Woodrow Kenrick Correspondence, which currently covers 1750 to 1783, but a second volume is incoming. As if all of that wasn't enough, she was also co-editor of Scottish Historical Review from 2018 to 2023. Talk about a high-flying, highly accomplished individual who makes me feel very bad about what I haven't been able to do in the equivalent length of time. Emma, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well. Thank you for having me back.
So we're going to pick this up sort of where we left off, which is why, folks, I urge you to go back and listen to the first part, because we're not one for, I mean, look, the way this show works, we go so far off topic anyway, that if we went and recapped what we did in the previous episode, we would be here until the end of time itself. So in the interests of actually having some kind of definitive endpoint to all of these episodes, we're not going to recap what we did previously, but we are going to pick up on a facet of what we were talking about, which was the different styles of patriotism and the different forms that generally people have identified when it comes to patriotism. But where I think your work gets particularly interesting is what I'm going to grandiosely term the fifth element, the facet of patriotism that you particularly see that hasn't necessarily been picked up on before, which broadly speaking is sort of independent patriotism. Give us a little bit of a sense, first of all, of what you mean by that term, but then also how that kind of, I guess, is visible, because there is a really important question there about, what is it that you've seen that we've missed so far? but also how does it manifest itself? Where are the sort of the differences, the similarities, the overlap, all of these things? Because this is a really interesting new perspective that really was kind of fundamental to what we wanted to discuss in the first episode. And now we're going to do it properly.
Great, thank you very much. So I think lots of people have talked really interesting and written really interestingly about a number of different forms of patriotism in the 18th century. And we talked about some of those before. The sort of national interest patriotism, which is not so much my country right or wrong, but I want my country to be the best that it can be, and we're not doing it well at the moment. Through a much more cosmopolitan form of patriotism, which is often associated with Richard Price, the discourse and the love of our country, which is much more about the brotherhood of man. Um, then the at moments when, particularly towards the end of the 18th century and once we're into the wars, um, when opinion is particularly polarized and there's a particular impetus for people to get behind the government and the army, the navy, the armed forces generally. There's this loyalist patriotism, which is not the only form of patriotism, but particularly dominant. We talked last time about female patriotism, as it's sometimes termed, which is almost an offshoot of that loyalist patriotism, and various activities that women were encouraged to get involved with in order to support the armed forces in the war effort. And what I was suggesting was that there is a less partisan form of patriotism. And I was looking at it through the lenses of two women writers, in particular, Elizabeth Carter and Anna Seward. So it's not to suggest this is only something that women did, but it's a form of being very concerned again for one's country, but not being tied to a particular viewpoint. That's, I think, what I meant by independent, that you can change your mind as events change. And I think that's what I was seeing, particularly through the letters of Elizabeth Carter and Anna Seward, that as events changed, as they read different books, as they listened to different opinions, they changed their minds. I think that's very relatable, but I don't think it makes them any less patriotic. I think they really cared about their country. They cared about public virtue. They cared about the outcome of the war. They cared about people losing their lives. Um, but it didn't mean that they stuck to an opinion and didn't change their minds.
So many places we could go with this, not least what causes them to change their perspectives and their opinions. But I suspect Liam is sort of giving me one of those looks of, oi, that was my question. Be quiet, White. We'll come to that later. So instead, I will cede the field to him on that one. But what I am curious about is sort of, I mean, as you say, this is something that you've seen through the lens of looking at the work of Seward and Carter. But why perhaps hasn't this become, and this isn't a kind of, oh, people haven't seen it before, therefore it can't be the case. That's absolutely not my argument. It's sort of why do you feel this has been missed up until this point in time? Is there something sort of unique about Seward and Carter in terms of the way in which they express themselves that makes this that much more apparent? Or actually, now that you sort of have identified this sort of facet of patriotism, do you look at the work of other writers, male and female, and actually see a very similar thing emerging in that actually it's just the categorization and this sort of different way of categorizing that is sort of opening up a different way of looking at patriotism writ large?
Thank you. I don't think I probably want to claim that it had been missed or hadn't been seen before. It was just that I was looking at these women who are sometimes called blue stockings and interested in what they made of the war because they were intelligent, educated, intellectual onlookers, partly because they were women. That often some women are fighting in this war, but by and large, men are the participants and women are onlookers. Many men are onlookers also, but by and large, that is the split. So I was interested in looking to see what they had to say. And this seemed to me to be a useful way to categorize how these particular women were discussing the war, as opposed to me thinking, oh, nobody's seen this before, I should point it out. It's more a case of this is a way of understanding what they were doing. And I've forgotten the second question that you asked me. I'm sorry.
That's right. That was for Liam to pick up on anyway. Liam?
Yeah, indeed. I just wanted to pick up on something that you talked about in that sort of really awesome link question between the two parts, and those sort of key events that led Seward and Carter and probably others like them, I'm sure, to change their patriotism, that independent patriotism. And I wonder, I'm going to guess and say that I'm guessing it's a mix of external events, I don't know, victories abroad, defeats abroad, and I'm sure there's a good amount of their own domestic circumstances potentially changing that would lead to a new viewpoint. So yeah, I wonder if you could give us a sense of what those sort of key events are.
Sure, thanks. So just before I get into those events, the other thing to bring in here is that they seem to me to be alignable with a group of politicians in Parliament who were not partisan, who were known as the independent country gentlemen. And these are people who, by default, supported the government, except when they thought the government was going catastrophically off the rails and doing something dangerous for the good in terms of the interests of the country. And I think that is quite an important stance, particularly for Elizabeth Carter. By default, she is small L loyalist, I guess, but she's a critical friend. And Anna Seward, I think, by default would have been a Fox out Whig, but was a critical friend there too. I mean, she could be pretty hard on Fox and his friends as well. So I think that's probably quite important in terms of where they're coming from. That those would be the roots. What's interesting is that they're able to switch, and what are the things that make them switch? Initially, it's the events of the French Revolution, and it's what they're reading about the French Revolution. So Anna Seward in particular is hugely relatable. I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't for the fact that, particularly if you think about the second Iraq war, it is what the British public by and large did. We were not very keen to go to war. Then all of a sudden, we heard about these so-called weapons of mass destruction, and we were going to war. And public opinion switched and got behind the government, got behind the military effort until doubts began to creep in as to whether these weapons of mass destruction actually existed, at which point opinion turned again. So it would be reasonably easy to be a bit sniffy about Anna Seward, who's particularly clear in terms of her trajectory in the letters that are left to us, and to say, oh, she was very female. She changed her mind all the time. She didn't have a firm opinion. If we didn't recognize that ability in ourselves to change our minds as events change and as what we read changes. So with Seward, she starts off actually reading the published letters of her friend Helen Maria Williams, who published 8 volumes of letters from France. It was her sorry, I'm being really incoherent here. Her literary device for publishing was letters. And as Seward says, she showed the public the sunny side of the French Revolution. And she's a friend, and Anna Seward loves this stuff and wants to believe that things are going right, that there's progress happening in the world in the home of absolute monarchy. She wants to believe that this is going well. And she doesn't actually get round to reading Burke's reflections on the revolution in France for some weeks after it comes out, partly because it takes a while to reach her circulating library, which is interesting in itself. She'd only read extracts. And then eventually she read it. And she was intellectually honest enough to say, yeah, I don't like a lot of his opinions, but actually he's convinced me that Williams's view was just too rosy. And actually things are not great in France. So that was her view gloomily for some time until Paine's Rights of Man, Part 1 came out. and various other replies to Burke. She read Wollstonecraft, she read Sir Brooke Boothby's reply as well. And at that point, she's quite relieved actually to be able to critique Burke and to think that he's not necessarily right. She actually doesn't swallow pain whole either, but she's relieved to feel that actually things might be going better in France than she'd thought. However, as the events of the French Revolution continue and as they go to war against Austria and Prussia, and it looks as if we're going to be pulled in as well, at that point, she begins to become much more of a supporter of William Pitt, which I think was a surprise to her. She's particularly keen on the third party, which is this group of MPs which moves away from the Foxite benches towards the middle benches and says, well, we will support the government on the war, on France, and on what might become war, but we'll continue to oppose them on everything else. And once we're at war, she is behind the government. She's behind the armed forces. It's a defensive war. France declared war on us. And that's where she finds herself until Pitt says, actually, we're at war until the death. We're going to stay at war until revolution in France is defeated. And at that point, she says, no, actually, this is not what war should be about. War is wasteful of blood and treasure, and Pitt has disappointed me, and she moves back to supporting Fox and so on. So I think she's just enormously relatable in following events and in following what she reads carefully and seriously about events. And I think she's patriotic in the sense that she wants the best for the country, rather than sticking to one particular leader or one particular view of things and not changing her mind in a way that you can see lots of politicians finding it really very. I mean, the Foxites tie themselves in knots because they're so keen for France to be right. And privately, they're desperately in turmoil about the violence in France. But in public, they can't quite let that go. And they have to say, oh, more sinned against than sinning. And this is all very unfortunate. But actually, this is where things end up after an absolute monarchy. And that's just the way of things. But because she's not tied to a party, she's able to come and go and say, no, actually, that's terrible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope when you started at that answer and you used the analogy of the second Iraq conflict, there was just light bulbs going on all around me, because I think that's just such an interesting way of looking at it and making it very, very relatable. And I just wondered, is in your experience and in in your work around these subjects, are those fairly common? Are those sort of changes fairly common? Because I think one thing that we're quite guilty of in hindsight is taking some of the human element away from it and the spontaneity away from it, because we kind of know what happens in the end. Is that a normal position, do you think, for I want to ask particularly for women at the time?
I don't know that I would tie it particularly to women. I think I would tie it to people who are not professional politicians, or related to them, or tied very closely to people who are, when I say professional politicians, we all know they're not paid, but people for whom that's a career politician. There we are, or presumably career military, career Navy. And I'm saying that because I'm thinking partly about the newspapers, actually, because you very often get really interesting opinions being expressed in the newspapers, but particularly because of this correspondence that Zach kindly mentioned that I've been working on with my good friends Anthony Page and Martin Fitzpatrick, the Woodrow Kenrick correspondence. So James Woodrow is this Church of Scotland minister in Ayrshire. Samuel Kenrick, banker near Birmingham. They'd been at Glasgow University together in the 1740s, and they wrote to each other for 60 years between 1750 and 1810. And there's a wonderful set of letters, and they discuss everything. And they're really, really interesting and interested in the wars against America and then against France. And they don't agree, and that's what makes them fascinating, because their letters get longer and longer as they try to persuade each other. And then once they realize they're not going to, they're kind of defending their position. And please don't think badly of me because I support the government or because I support the other side. But there you can see them reacting to events. You can see them reacting to what they're reading, because they are not like Seward or Carter. They're not tied to a party that they have to keep supporting, or partisan viewpoint that they have to keep supporting. They're sometimes a bit pig-headed about their own views, but generally speaking, they are able to give ground and take ground depending what evidence they can bring to bear. Which again is lovely from a historical point of view, to see people using evidence and saying, look, this is why. But I think that must have been, it must have been the case. And it must have been the case for ordinary people as well, who are dealing with taxes. They're dealing with victories, which are just exciting, in the middle of a long war, and the taxes are dreadful, and you've lost family members, or they've gone, and you don't know when they're coming back, but there's a bonfire going on, and Duncan's won at Camperdown or something like that, and there's a reason to feel a bit more confident, a bit more hopeful. It's a very, very, very long war for a country to be engaged in. So you can see public opinion coming and going, with prices rising and falling, and taxes rising and falling, and troops being garrisoned or troops going off, and there being all kinds of exciting things going on around troops being stationed near you, or your relatives go off to war, or your business collapses because people are not buying fancy goods anymore. All kinds of things, either directly associated with the war or which can be blamed on the war. So yeah, I think people are changing their views all the time.
I'm about to derail this entire interview. Not for the first time in my podcasting career. Liam's face right now. I wish I'd taken a photo of you. As I said that. In fact, I might screenshot it. I might go back and snip that out of the recording. Because one of the things that really struck me, as you were saying, literally what you've just said there about sort of the news coming in and all the rest of it, is access to information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these women are intelligent. They have the ability to read. So where are they getting their information is firstly a really interesting question that I'm keen for us to explore. But built into that is then a sort of sub question of, inevitably a good chunk of their information has to come from the papers, right? That is how the bulk of information is distributed around the country. It's either going to be through the papers or it's going to be through written letters. How much trust is therefore placed on their respective publications, and how much is the papers that they choose to read, or the papers that they have access to, something that influences the direction in which their opinions on the matter shift?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, they don't just rely on the papers, so they do, but they are well connected, or in the case of Elizabeth Carter, well located. So she lived in Deal in Kent, and she goes down and bothers the portmaster. She wants to know what's happening before it's going to get into the papers, so she knows about ships coming in, and ship movements. So she doesn't just rely on the papers, and she questions the papers, or she'll tell her correspondents, actually, that's not right. I had it from the shipmaster or whatever. And similarly, Seward. So Seward is in Lichfield, so she's not nearly so happily placed from that point of view, but she is well connected. And she has this massive correspondence network. And just to derail from myself for a moment, I think that's the other thing that's very interesting about these letters, because they're not just private letters in the way that the Woodrow Kenrick letters are entirely private. Again, what makes this form of patriotism a little bit different from the kind of independent-minded letter writing that people had done forever, is the fact that they were not writing to one individual for one individual's eyes only, or their families. It was accepted that you wrote to one person, and that letter got passed around the rest of the circle blue stockings, men and women. So it was a kind of semi-public, semi-private thing. And I think that makes it a little bit different from a letter that's just written to one, from A to B and B to A. It's a different kind of correspondence. So Seward has this enormous correspondence network, including many people in London with access to news that she wasn't necessarily getting. I don't know what paper she took, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the Morning Chronicle, which is the main Foxite Whig leaning paper. And if I had to bet, it would be the Times that Elizabeth Carter would be taking. But again, I don't know. But I think what I'm saying is that both of them were people who didn't simply take what they read in the newspapers. They did, because that was what was there. And as you say, and there's a lot in the papers, they're very substantial, but they're also looking for information wherever they can get it.
Within these letters, you talk about the press, and obviously it's a really hot topic at the moment. Do these individuals show any sort of evidence of internal conflict with what they're hearing, either verbally from friends or what they're reading within the papers, that would sort of suggest that their opinions are changing in a way that they might not necessarily want them to, like, I believe this, but I'm hearing this. And, that sort of internal struggle that you have, very relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, though, less in terms, just in terms of what I know, less in terms of the war itself and military thinking, and more in terms of the politics. So Anna Seward is clearly uncomfortable with the fact that she is more convinced by Edmund Burke than she is by Helen Maria Williams, because she would much rather both be convinced by her friend and have that happier, more rosy view of what was going on in Paris than Burke's very pessimistic view. And she didn't particularly like him and his politics anyway. So that is very uncomfortable for her. And pain really is too radical for her. So she's not very keen on that either when she swings. She's relieved. You can feel the relief there, but not entirely comfortable with it. And she is much more comfortable when she eventually gets through all of these different concatenations and gets through her pit phase and is solidly back in the Foxite Whig camp. She is much more comfortable there as an opposition politician, criticising the government and feeling that she's got the right to do that. The other thing that I think she's very interesting on is she's clearly aware that it might be regarded as unfeminine for her to be as deeply into the politics of it all as she is. So she's got this fascinating letter where she describes all kinds of facets of the home front. She's going through the business of prisoners of war and a concert that they put on in a neighbouring town. I'm trying now to remember the details of this letter. Anyway, the prisoners of war, and that's a reasonable thing for a woman to be involved in. Just a concert involved in aid of their upkeep. She's a bit annoyed that people are so uncharitable towards them, and she feels sorry for all of them, and all of that is quite female. But once she moves from that into criticism of the Pitt administration, she knows that that is material that is less likely to be regarded as solidly female patriotism, if you like. So I don't think she has a problem with that, but she's very aware that this is not actually something that everybody would endorse. So two kind of forms of internal turmoil, I think. And in terms, if I can just move off the women again for a minute, back to Woodrow and Kenrick, they don't like disagreeing with each other, actually. They'll do it and they don't give in because their best friend thinks differently, but it is uncomfortable for them to think differently from each other and they don't really like it. So, and that is something I think, again, very relatable for us now when there are so many issues on which we disagree and on which we're kind of led to believe there's only one right true way for progressive people to think. It is quite difficult to say, I'm a liberal, but actually I think this. And I think that's where James Woodrow finds himself and where Elizabeth Carter actually would find herself from time to time also.
Absolutely. I mean, on this podcast, for all that we heckle one another and generally sort of wind each other up, we're generally quite harmonious. But Liam and I have had heated debates about the particular color schemes of the liveries on historic steam engines, and I maintain that his love of the LNER color scheme is completely incorrect, and he thinks that I'm borderline a heathen, frankly, for preferring the classic British rail thing. Like, clearly, there is a lot less at stake in the conversations we have
I
in
was
the
about to say that
background.
sounds pretty fundamental to me.
Well, see, it's fundamental if you accept that I am right, which Liam does not. And this is where the anarchy develops. And until Liam accepts that I'm correct, then I maintain that there is a risk that this podcast will descend into anarchy akin to the French Revolution.
Well, you see, this is what I mean, the danger of cancel culture. I'm not even going to get involved in that one.
It's probably a good conversation to not get involved in. But speaking of the French Revolution, I am going to make a segue out of that because I do want to just kind of zoom out from all of this and look at the macro in terms of what is or is not changing for women in terms of that gender gap, in terms of the treatment, in terms of the conversations that are going on over the course of the Revolutionary Wars. The reason I do this is because, as we've talked about in passing on this show before, the situation for women changes quite fundamentally over the course within France, changes quite fundamentally over the course of the revolutionary period, right? You've got the situation pre-revolution, not exactly enlightened in many aspects. Then you have this much more liberal situation. Lots of debates, of course, about whether or not that sort of almost happens by accident, which is certainly a school of thought, and that actually the revolutionaries sort of catch themselves out almost by kind of going, okay, everybody's equal. Oh, hang on a minute. We didn't really mean that women were going to be equal. Oh no, we can't put the genie back in the bottle now, can we? And then Napoleon, of course, sweeps in and goes, well, hold my beer. We absolutely can put that genie back in the bottle. So that's a lot that's going on within a French context. And of course, all of this is tied up with what are we as Britons? Are we French? Do we accept what's going on in France as a good idea? Actually, there's so much anarchy that maybe we don't want to embrace those ideals, but also we are anti Napoleon because the war then bleeds in from the French Revolutionary Wars into the Napoleonic Wars. And then Napoleon taking those rights away from women is a stick that you could choose to beat him with in certain circles if you were living in a society that had an enlightened attitude towards women, which isn't necessarily the case in Britain in the early 1800s, which is all a sort of very long-winded way of saying, to what extent does the changing situation for women in France influence what happens to women in Britain?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think it does. I think maybe there are at least two levels on which we need to think about that question, which is firstly, how does it influence the national conversation about women, at least among the chattering classes? And secondly, how does it influence actually the experience of women? And I think it probably changes the conversation more than it changes the lived experience of most women. So I think the initial opening of public activity to women in France is probably the thing that has the biggest impact on the national conversation in Britain about women, because it's horrific for the establishment. Revolution is horrific. If you associate with revolution women becoming involved, then one of the things you need to do is make sure that women are not involved in politics in Britain. So it's always interesting teaching Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women with Undergraduates, because they're so disappointed that she says so very little about the vote. It was published in 1792, and she does mention it, and I suspect that was quite a brave thing to do in 1792. She says, I might excite some laughter by dropping a hint that I really think that women shouldn't be governed without having some representatives. And she moves off that pretty quickly, but it's there. What one wants to say to undergraduates is, yes, but actually she is doing something really radical with the politics of society at the most basic unit, which is the home, and to say that actually we need to be looking at equality in the home, and you get equality right there, then it will fall everywhere else. But I think there was really a moment in 1792 when she was writing through to 1793, when Anglo-French relationships were becoming more and more dodgy, when women were still at large in French political clubs and had not yet been shut down, when it was actually quite difficult to write for a woman, particularly to write about political rights. So I think that what the French did in the first few years of the revolution was remembered as being part of the just the violence of events. I don't necessarily mean that everything was violent, it was, but the violence of events, the violence of the change that was happening. And I think that is really damaging to the cause of women's public activities in Britain, at least insofar as they were being talked about. So you have somebody like Letitia Matilda Hawkins, in her book Letters on the Female Mind in just 1793, saying that most British women didn't know very much about the French Revolution and didn't want to know very much either, which I think was what Letitia Matilda Hawkins hoped rather than necessarily the truth. You've got Richard Polwhele saying similar things, Horace Walpole, various people coming out and being really very damning of women being involved in politics at all. And it does actually affect the Blue Stockings after their deaths. So the way that their letters were edited, including by family members, suffered. They redact things, they excise bits of letters. And then they say in the introduction she wasn't really very interested in politics, because even mid-19th century, that was not something that you wanted people to think about your elderly maiden aunt sort of thing, or your elderly married aunt, depending on who it was. So there's kind of a view that women were basically there either to be defended from French savagery were they to have reached our shores, or that they might have been fifth columnists, sexually particularly, and they were just gagging for a troop of French to come over and be available. So that's the kind of gloomy side of things. I think, on the other hand, women are still writing this stuff. And the women that I was talking about in that particular chapter, they're not publishing these opinions, but as I say, they're not wholly private opinions either. And they're being written for men who respect them for their scholarship and their intellect, as well as for women. Women are reading pretty much what men were reading if they wanted to. Jenny Batchelor's brilliant stuff on the Ladies' Magazine makes it very clear that men are reading the Ladies' Magazine and women are reading the Gentleman's Magazine. So, it's just a different form of publication. Then you have people like Anna Barbauld, Catherine Macaulay, Mary Wollstonecraft, Helen Maria Williams, Hannah More, both sides of the political divide, who are absolutely publishing. Sometimes they get into hot water for it. Hannah More has a pretty terrible time, but it's not as if men are not given a hard time for their opinions in print either. So I think that because all of these things are being said in public, it makes it a little bit more difficult to equate independence with masculinity. I think Matthew McCormack's book, The Independent Man, is brilliant. But actually, these women, they're not typical, but they're important. And they're not hiding behind anonymity either. People knew who they were. They're entering the public debate. They're not just writing about religion or morality or education and so on. They're writing about public affairs too. So in terms of what they're doing, I mean, they're not typical. I suppose the other way in which they're not typical, apart from their education and so on, is their wealth, but they're not Duchess of Sutherland type wealthy either. They're not people who control parliamentary seats. They're sort of upper middling ranks. They're not absolutely elite. It's not that they have money to throw away, all of them. So yeah, sorry, I'm rambling now. I'm going to stop.
As I put it to Liam, I'm not going to so much take us down a rabbit hole as into a sinkhole with this next question, because you struck on something really interesting there about sort of fifth columnist fears, and all these ladies will be swept off their feet by some devastatingly handsome Frenchman who just sort of happens to wander up off the Dorset beaches. Contrast that, obviously I'm being very flippant there, folks, but you can get the thrust of it. Contrast that with the phenomenon of scarlet fever, which of course is, oh, this is terrible, all of these ladies are sort of lusting after redcoats, and we can't have that because these people are soldiers, and it's one of those things, you can't have it both ways. Either these ladies are having their head, I guess, yeah, you're quite right. You can have it both ways because they did. Um, but either these ladies surely are kind of having their heads turned by these devilishly handsome red-coated soldiers who are sort of doing this wonderful patriotic duty, and that's sort of all very well and good and to be encouraged, but don't get too amorous with a soldier because it's not very respectable. Or they're having their heads turned by the French, and that's more of a problem. There's a very obvious contradiction there that is bugging me. And I suppose my question is twofold. One, does anybody bother to interrogate that contradiction? Um, and two, how how does how do these two theories manage to coexist when they are obviously contradictory?
Okay, so I think the contradiction is potentially solved by the principle that women should simply not be running around after men generally. That 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 is basically, it is still fine in the late 18th century for the sexual double standard to exist. It is fine for a man to take his pleasure where he will. It is absolutely not fine for a woman to take her pleasure where she will. And it's certainly not fine for her to be caught doing it or to be seen doing it. So I think that really is what cuts the Gordian knot. But just thinking about it as you were talking, I think where particularly the potential fifth columnist via sex is most obviously discussed as in some of the worst scurrilous cartoons of Gilray. And I think he is there accusing women of a different class of running after Frenchmen than those who might have appeared in a Jane Austen novel, who are much more interested in your Wickhams and so on in the garrison camps.
Liam, I am handing that straight over to you after that facial expression you pulled. Obviously, great to reference facial expressions on a radio show, but where were you going with that train of thought?
Well, I've got in my notes here written down class question mark, and it was more related to some of the parts you were talking about earlier. With obviously that these women, they're not part of necessarily the aristocracy. They're not, like you said, they're not attached to politicians and owning political sort of influence in that sense. How do you see this kind of independent patriotism affecting the class structure? Because that's obviously a structure within the gender structure. And is there any evidence of them contradicting themselves, or are they all sort of working together in tandem generally, and with they sort of ups and downs as events change? Yeah, and I wondered how perhaps the working class were affected by that, and if there's any evidence that demonstrates.
Wow. No, I don't think they're working in tandem together. I think, and this is speculation and thinking off the top of my head, really, that in terms of independence, at least, it goes back to what we said earlier, that people's views of events changed, and I think they changed understandably as events affected them. So I think people were then, as now, likely to be default patriotic and supporting their country until what their country was doing affected them badly or well. So if your family business does well out of the war, if you are leather workers or ship workers or involved in some industry, involved in supplying government contracts, or working in agriculture, then actually you're more likely to take a more lenient view of the continuation of the war than you are if your family was involved in some form of commerce that is really dislocated by the war. And then similarly, taxes and prices and all these things, it depends how well you're insulated from these different pressures. So that would be my guess. Are you working in a port town? Are you working somewhere where people are coming in and out? It's busy, it's doing quite well. Are you working in a bit of a rural backwater, maybe a little market town where actually it's pretty hard to make ends meet? So just in terms of the independence, if we define that as non-partisan and non-settled in your view of events, then I think that affects anybody, from the best informed to the least informed. I think you both probably know much better than I do whether my instinct is right, that it was pretty difficult to go through this war not knowing that the country was at war. I think it was too all-encompassing for people not to know about it. And I stick to my view that this war was as close as one gets to proto-totalizing, let's say, before the 20th century, although I'm quite attracted by the view that the American Revolutionary War was moving towards that also. But anyway, maybe back on safer ground, I think it's difficult for people not to know that we're at war. 23 years is a long time. But families were affected by it differently depending on their family members and friends being involved directly in the war and the family economy being affected by the war. If that doesn't answer your question, Liam, have another go. I'm not sure, but I definitely don't think there's a kind of independent female patriotic party that moves as one,
No.
regardless of class.
Okay. And within that, and sorry for sort of holding the torch up, as it were. Do obviously Seward and Carter, like we've said, are very educated and probably quite insulated, as you've said, from the kind of, dare I say, the harsher realities of life on the home front. Would do you think that literacy rates would be a sort of a marker for being better informed? Because you can read is obvious, right? If you can read the newspaper, you're going to be better informed. But particularly, I guess, within working class, and again, I'm looking at women. Traditionally, the literacy rates were lower, particularly at the bottom end of the spectrum. So, how would literacy rates affect how the classes viewed that sort of independent patriotism, or any of the other forms of patriotism, for that matter?
Sure. Well, I mean, clearly it's a really important factor, and as is actually access to the things that might be read, access to the newspapers themselves. But we've got really great evidence of newspapers being bought by one person and then handed around lots of people. So the implication, I think, is that the spread of information could be quite important. There's a great piece of evidence from Devon, I think Tiverton in Devon in around about 1797, I think, where the local laird, we'd have called him in Scotland, the squire, I suppose, buys the newspaper. It gets handed round a list of about 6 or 7 different named individuals, and then was handed round the common people, quote unquote. So it's the information, I think, is there to be had. It's commonly known. So whether or not you were the person who read it, and presumably you're better informed and you're able to engage with it critically if you're reading it, and perhaps there's a bit of Chinese whispers going on if you're not reading it yourself, but you're getting it edited through whoever's telling you what was in the paper, because you're getting what they thought was important and you're getting their take on it. But nonetheless, it's not that you're completely left out of the information loop. Does that
I
help? And
love
then,
I love how the fact that you introduce bias into that, and how by if you're getting the news from someone who's getting the news from someone, and that kind of, that bias changing each time, it would really, really change your perspective on world events.
it's Twitter for the 18th century, right?
See, I'm very conscious this is your interview, Emma, and not mine. But my immediate reaction to all of this was, what about visual media?
Yeah.
Dr. Luke Reynolds also enters the chat at this point, wanting to talk about theatre and sort of various bits of tat that are sold for patriotic purposes and all the rest of it. But I can't do that whole thing as well as Luke. But I'm just thinking, we were talking about Gilray earlier, right? And yes, Gilray as a caricature, there's a big debate there about the art form and who has access to it. Liam and I recently went on a trip to Stratfield Sci. I think we'll kind of claim it was a research trip, but it was just a shindig, really. We went to the pub afterwards. I was actually very struck that Wellington didn't have any funny caricatures on his caricature in his print room, where you would have displayed all of these. I felt that said quite a lot about Wellington and his sense of humor. But the whole point about Gilray and other caricaturists like him, whether it was Malcolmson or some of the sort of slightly cruder sort of woodcut style prints, was that they were trying to tap across multiple individuals, because you don't just disseminate your prints to the wealthy classes, the people who can afford the time that it takes to get them colored in. You can also do the knockoffs and the print runs off of the worn out plates, which then sell much more cheaply, and they end up in barber shops or pubs or latrines or you name it. Now, I'm not saying that caricatures are necessarily, the greatest source of information for what's going on in the war, but they're nonetheless part of that wider conversation that's happening, because that's what caricatures are there to do. They tap into that. And women aren't, there's no way to physically measure it. So in some respects, this waffly anecdote from me is completely pointless. But women don't sort of sit at home quietly and meekly sort of do the washing or the knitting or the darning or whatever. They are in these public places. They are exposed to them, and they are an integral part. They're literally half the population having, excuse me, sorry, I've got very ranty here, having half the conversation. So I refuse to believe that they're not exposed to this, that they're not finding ways to engage with it. And I think, Liam, you're absolutely right to raise literacy, and to what extent does that have an influence? I think fundamentally, my ill-informed take would be there's a difference perhaps in some of the ways in which that access to information is facilitated, but that's not to therefore imply that that access to information doesn't happen.
I'm sure that's right. I think if material is coming into the home, then women are seeing it as well as men. And just, I guess, to support your point about access to visual media, I tend to try to put the brakes on students thinking that this is a democratic form of media. But okay, there's the Gilrays, the Cruikshankses, the Rowlandsons, the big artists in London. but there are artists elsewhere in the country as well. One of my favourites is John Kay in Edinburgh. He's a hairdresser, but in the dull moments, he's drawing and eventually makes enough money, gives up the hairdressing, and he's a lovely, gentle satirist, much gentler than Gilray. But one of the so that's a kind of local form, and you know how many people are doing that in other towns and cities in Britain. But the other thing to say is not just that women are consumers of these things, but also they're in there. They are being displayed in these prints, sometimes as a way of poking fun at men. You know, who wears the trousers. There's a brilliant one of Lord and Lady Breadalbane, and she is absolutely in the military breeches and he's in the kilt, and she is leading him by the leading rein. And it's a way of poking fun at, well, both of them probably, but him in particular. He comes off first in that print, and that's John Kay. So women are displayed in these, are being discussed in these prints as men are.
I want to take us forward a little bit, if you don't mind, Emma, and I want to look at the legacy of these guys, of Seward, of Carter, of the Blue Stockings, and how much influence do they have on female writers, and I guess female independent patriotism on the apologies, and the other forms sort of demonstrated by females. How much influence does that have on them going forwards, and into and through the Napoleonic Wars, and I guess beyond that as well, into the 19th century?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I don't think I've got a very good answer to it, except that it is a noble tradition into which they are inserting themselves. I think they're doing it more through the period of the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars than they had done in public print before. And via the Blue Stockings, which is a moment, right? It's quite a long moment, but it is a moment. So I think the particular women that I'm talking about and the particular form of writing that I'm talking about, which is this semi-private, semi-public, they don't get published for a long time afterwards. And as I say, they get published in rather a bowdlerized form to start with. So I don't want to claim more for people like Carter and Seward than is really fair. But Seward is publishing on public affairs as well. She gets a lot of grief for her monody, and Major Andre, who's the British agent who gets hanged by Washington in the America 1781. So she's publishing, but lots of the others, people like Anna Barbauld, Wollstonecraft, Macaulay, Moore, the others that we talked about, they're publishing. So they're showing that it can be done. They're showing that a woman who thought and wrote intelligently was not like Samuel Johnson's dog walking on two legs. They certainly do their bit to establish the principle that it's acceptable for women to publish and write, not just on feminine things. I think my view is that Britain goes through quite a gloomy period for women in the first half of the 19th century. The kind of arc of what's acceptable, particularly for chattering class women to do, is in a real dip for much of the first half of the 19th century before it comes up again with the campaigns of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. When it does come up again, there is precedent there that women can think and write as intelligently as any man did. I am not sure, yeah, that there's a massive immediate legacy from what these women wrote, sadly. I don't think I want to say that there's a lot there to be optimistic about.
So as we start to sort of finish thinking about this topic, I'm curious about the sort of where do we go next? We've talked about sort of new ways of exploring patriotism. We've got sort of very well, no, I've got very angry about inconsistencies in terms of salacious um, attitudes and accusations leveled at these women as alleged fifth columnists. That we've There's a reason we've taken 2 episodes to unpack all of this, and it's not just the fact that I don't ask questions succinctly. It's very much about the fact that there is a huge amount to unpack here, a lot of which sometimes feels like it's behind a curtain. Sometimes people sort of don't readily realize the way in which all of this is inherently and intrinsically interconnected. So the question that I want to kind of end on is what's next in terms of where the study of women's expressions of political opinion needs to go, and perhaps also how do we spread the word, I guess, in order to ensure that more of these women's stories end up becoming much more mainstream in terms of people's thought about the politics and society and culture during this period, so that these conversations kind of happen faster and more neurons get fired in the process.
Yeah, those are nice questions. Thank you. Well, you're obviously doing your bit to raise the profile, so thank you. Um, I mean, I am not primarily um, an historian of women per se. This is not something that I spend most of my time on. So my sort of dive into Carter and Seward was great fun. But there are a lot of really terrific projects going on at the moment, digitizing the letters and writers and writings of important women writers. So I'm thinking about um, the Elizabeth Montagu Correspondence Online project. There's the Mary Hamilton project. There's Sophie Colombo's work on Fanny Burney. Um, there's a wonderful project being done just now in Scotland by Jade Scott on women of an earlier period, sort of early modern women. She is gathering as many letters as can be found written by women in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And I think those are the kinds of projects as we unearth more and more of what women were writing, if they weren't the majority writers for publication, what were they writing? Well, very often they're writing letters, and the more we know about what women said in letters, the more we'll be able to take the question of how they engaged with politics, with war, and so on forward. But the other thing I think I want to insert here then is that just a brilliant conference in Durham in the summer, organised by Naomi Lloyd Jones on the history of Scottish politics from the 18th century through the mid 20th century. And one of the things that struck me hard then was just how many things can be considered political. From we were discussing everything from railway posters to military balls to, who knows what, and the politics of, I've got a PhD student just submitted his thesis recently on the politics of reading, which is partly about what people read. And this is Josh Smith, may as well shout him out. It's partly about what they're reading and when they're reading it and how that marries with events at home and abroad. But it's also about the politics of subscription libraries, which is what he's worked on, and who gets to choose which books are held by libraries, and who makes the decisions about what goes on in libraries and the networking that goes on. So I think more and more we are seeing the politics, if politics is about power, in more and more aspects of life. So I think if you marry that approach to politics with the increasing availability of what women wrote through some of these brilliant correspondence digitization projects, where we are not redacting things that women may unfortunately have said about politics, and in fact being glad to read what they said about public affairs. Those might be ways forward. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I've we on this show have had the rant many times. It's a phenomenon that I know not all of our listeners necessarily enjoy having mentioned, but it's enormously frustrating and disheartening in many respects that when I, as a podcaster, put anything relating to women in the title of the show, instantly we guarantee losing 1/3 of our engagement. And the strangest thing actually is that it's not a Napoleonic phenomenon. So I was speaking to Eleanor Yaniger, who runs the Going Medieval podcast for Dan Snow's History Hit, and had exactly this conversation, particularly because we'd just been to the National Army Museum talking about women in positions of power across the early modern period. Um, and she finds exactly the same phenomenon. It is something that is just baked into the psyche of the public writ large. And in some respects, from my perspective as somebody who runs a show that is fundamentally about war and therefore is directed at a certain series of individuals with particular interest types, there's a little bit of me that's relieved that it's not just it's not unique to my show and it's not something that we on this podcast are doing wrong. But that, of course, is massively outweighed by the incredulity that for shows that clearly reach far wider demographics, it's just not something that is yet filtering through to the mainstream. And I was very, very struck actually when Eleanor Estelle Perronc and I did that session at the National Army Museum. We were preaching to the choir because 95% of that audience was female. So it's not reaching the facet of the population that I suspect would have their minds most surprised in some respects about just how interconnected all of this is. Because actually, what we're doing is having the conversations with the people who are going, well, yeah, I agree with all of this, but I knew it all already because, like, as a woman, I've had to think about all of these things and navigate these problems myself. And we will continue to beat the drum, quite obviously.
Thank you.
But yeah, folks, genuinely, as you're listening to this, if you've got thoughts and questions and you want to get involved in this discussion, please do. Please do the simple things, share this podcast with people who will be interested. And that goes for all podcasts, but especially ones where we're covering topics where we are trying to fly the flag and go, look, actually, these perceptions are being missed, and these points are being missed. Sorry, that was a very waffly kind of point on which to close, but it is a point on which to close. I did tell Liam that he was going to wrap, but because I've got the mic in front of me, I'm going to wrap. Emma, it has been an absolute joy to spend, I think it ended up being near enough 3 hours talking through these various facets with you. It's been a fascinating discussion. I wasn't sure where we were going to go in terms of how this conversation would play out. I certainly didn't think that we'd spend 3 hours discussing everything, but I think it's a testament to how generous you've been with your time, but also what a fascinating topic this has been. Folks, you've been listening to Emma MacLeod, Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Stirling. And please, please, please support the lovely people who give up huge amounts of their time by going and buying their work and fundamentally hearing more about their ideas. Now, as Emma has said, a lot of her work isn't specifically about women during this period. She covers a very wide range of kind of intellectual history during this period. So, A War of Ideas, British Attitudes to the Wars Against Revolutionary France, and British Visions of America, 1775 to 1820, are both books that you can go and get your hands on. They were published in 1998 and 2013, respectively. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Woodrow Kenrick correspondence, Volume 1 is out now. It covers 1750 to 1783, and Volume 2 is incoming. Emma, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.